Thank you so much. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to look at who's here. So many folks I admire and have thought alongside, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my recent thinking with you. So I'm going to share my screen, which Chris, it looks like you might need to let me do since I'm a participant. And I'll say, while that, oh, very good, thank you. Um, I'll say that while this is coming up, someone I talk a lot about in this paper is downstairs, very animatedly, decompressing from his second week of kindergarten. So if you hear shrieks of delight, hopefully they'll be of delight. If you hear shrieks, everything's fine. It's my kiddo. But this is Making Maps, Making Worlds, a young child's pandemic cartographies. I've included my email address here, my Twitter handle, if you want to get in touch at any point. So I'll just get to it here. Okay. Simon's sketchbook lays open next to our iPad and a pencil on the coffee table. Images from the PBS cartoon Molly of Denali move across the screen as Simon takes a sip of his milk. He sets down his cup, picks up the pencil, and begins to draw. I'm drawing a map, he tells me. Here's the ocean with water, and here's a river. Simon hunches over his sketchbook and presses his pencil to the page. And this is a seal, he declares. Simon straightens up and tucks his cup and pencil down the front of his shirt. I'm going camping, he tells me, as he picks up his sketchbook. This is my trail guide, he says. It looks like you're ready, I tell him. I'm all packed up, Simon declares, his arms balancing the sketchbook and iPad as he tries to secure his sippy cup and pencil under his shirt. Where are you going? I ask. I'm going camping, he reminds me. Simon was 2 years, 11 months old when the coronavirus pandemic forced the shuttering of schools and businesses in March of 2020. Like many children across the globe, his social network was altered when he could no longer see his friends at daycare or play with neighbors at our community playground. Simon spent his time with me, his academic mother, as we both tried to come to terms with a sudden jolt to our routines and ways of being. It was early in our time locked down together that Simon began to create maps with various materials around our house. Most of the time, Simon's maps were accompanied by his stories of people and places near and far, and routes that we might take, for instance, to visit his grandparents, who lived on the other side of the country. He often appropriated and embodied narratives from the shows that he watched, such as his play alongside Molly of Denali, an animated series featuring the experiences of a Native Alaskan girl who works at her family's trading post and often joins along in guided trips on the river and spends time engaged in outdoor adventures. At times, Simon told stories that actually deterritorialized existing maps, moving them beyond the confines of numbered and lettered grids and lines. For more than 2 years, I have had the privilege of watching Simon's maps come alive in their creation and in his play with them. My thinking with Simon about his maps is much like, and yet somehow feels very different from, my previous research endeavors with children. For the past decade or so, I have been involved in research with young children as a participant observer interested in their making, reading, writing, and play. Like Thompson and others, I rely on a pedagogy of being there and of observing and documenting, but also interacting with and responding to children, as I learn from them about the things that matter to them, how things come to matter, and the conditions under which they matter. While my research in classrooms has unfolded with a sense of formality, given the need for research proposals, IRB protocols, and the like, my research relationship with my own son has emerged organically as we go about our days. Sometimes he includes me in his making and play, and sometimes he doesn't. I am often compelled to document his making and stories because I really do find it all very interesting. But I am also aware of how the black rectangle that is my iPhone, with its recording and sharing capacities, has the potential to mediate my relationship with him in very particular ways. and I don't necessarily want that for him or for me. So I say all of this because I want to be clear that I did not begin to document Simon's cartographies with any intention of ever sharing them. Rather, I wanted to remember the time, to create some kind of archive of a pandemic childhood and how we built worlds together. So in this paper, I connect with Manning's 2020 work on becoming child and Stewart's 2014 articulations of worlding in consideration of 3 highly contextualized mapping events with Simon, all of which emerged within the first 18 months of the coronavirus pandemic. I share my attunements to researching with one's own child, and I bring attention to the things, human and more than human, that came together in assemblages to create new ways of being and becoming with materials and with one another. And I've lost my mouse. Let me find it really quickly. Okay, there we go. So in the introduction of her 2020 article, Radical Pedagogies and Meta-Modelings of Knowledge in the Making, Erin Manning presents 3 scenes. In the first, a parent advocates for her child's multilingualism, given a doctor's concerns that the child cannot write. Sure, the child may speak 3 languages, but the child's inability to do what is expected at this point, developmentally and behaviorally, is what concerns the doctor. In the second scene, Manning directs us to Malaguzzi's poem. The child has 100 languages, 100 hands, 100 ways of thinking, of playing, of speaking, 100, always 100 ways of listening. And of the 100, they steal 99. They tell the child that work and play, reality and fantasy, science and imagination, sky and earth, reason and dream are things that do not belong together. Finally, Manning helps us to engage with Delaney, who wrote that the real work of maps is to retrace the wander line of a child and to notice that this wander line escapes us, that we do not catch all that might be the child's project, to note that the wander lines are magnetized by something. So these 3 scenes together speak to the ways in which children perpetually break out of the constraints that adults attempt to apply to their playing, making, and being, and how children seem to exist in an excess that we will never quite capture or understand. As an early childhood teacher, I was always intrigued by this excess, by the surprising and indeterminate ways that children played and made things. When I studied for my PhD and started reading the writings of Deleuze and Guattari, I engaged for the first time with theories that made sense to me in terms of how language might fall short in interpreting that indeterminacy, how sometimes we just sense something and recognize its generativity, and how in allowing ourselves to be affected by the curious wandering of childhood, we might foster space for multiple ways of children becoming in the world. Much of children's being and becoming has to do with their relationships with things, human and more than human. Much has been written about these relationships, particularly in the past decade, and those who invoke post-humanist philosophies, and I include myself among that group, often draw from Barad's conceptualizations of interactivity, entanglements, and materiality to examine how things come to matter in relationships with bodies, both human and more than human. The critical aspect of this work in early childhood involves moving beyond the constraints of behavioral and developmental paradigms that limit our images of and assumptions about the child in the name of predetermined expectations, so that we might honor the excess, to recognize the always moreness of childhood that is invoked in children's playing and being in the world. It's getting a little rowdy downstairs, so if I chuckle randomly, that's probably why. From a post-humanist standpoint, becoming is a relational process of matter, materiality, and things, an idea that Kathleen Stewart posits as worlding in her 2014 essay, Tactile Compositions. She writes, some assemblage of affects, effects, conditions, sensibilities, and practices throws itself together into something recognizable as a thing. Disparate and incommensurate elements, human and non-human, given and composed, cohere and take on force as some kind of real, a world. There is something very active, propelled by effective force, that transforms an object into a thing. And while the potential always exists, it is always in relation to other matter that the object moves beyond a standalone representation, as it becomes something that has an impact on and changes its surroundings. Stewart goes on, she works with Heidegger's ideas in this essay, and she writes, Heidegger asks what it might mean to meet the world not as a representation, interpretation, or raw material for exploitation, but as a nearing, a gathering of the ring between subjects and objects into something that feels like something. To thing is to world. An object that has become a thing is not flat and inert before a voraciously dominant subject, but an enigma, a provocation. To thing is to world. Worlding is then an active process of moving beyond what is familiar or assumed, about childhood, about drawing, about storying, about being, as things come together in relation, driven by and creating effective forces with the potential to change things, to transform from one moment to the next. Blakey describes worlding as both a theoretical framing and a method that has the potential to be disruptive to familiar representations of being. She writes, worlding invites us to consider the individual and collective experiences, taking into account the extraordinary visual, affective, material, and spatial qualities of our lives. As a theoretical framework, worlding is a lens through which to consider how experiences and ways of being and becoming are constituted in relationships between the human and more than human. As heterogeneous bodies come together in encounters of mapping and storying, for example, fields or worlds that are new and then invoke speculation on possibilities form up. The entanglement of the more than human in the composition of worlds is critical. Stewart's description of a thing as a provocation echoes Bennett's conceptualization of the vitality of things, which in their relationship with the human and more than human have the agency to animate, to act, to produce effects dramatic and subtle. As an actant, a thing has the power to do as it sets an event into motion. A thing, and this is from Stewart, throws a worlding together out of objects and attunements, practices, and incipient tendencies. Thus, things are inextricable from a worlding, a creation of something new, that is both a doing and, as Donna Haraway reminds us, a storing. I want to shift here a bit to a consideration of things and worlding in relation to research with young children. It is no small thing to be a bearer of the worlds and stories that are created in children's affective relationships with the media, paper, pencils, sketch pads, trail maps, sippy cups, and on and on. Haraway writes, it matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. Admittedly, there is some uneasiness on my part as I share Simon's maps in this talk. As I mentioned earlier, it was never my intention to disseminate his maps and the stories that accompany them, perhaps beyond our family and a relatively small circle of friends. Indeed, the entire process of theorizing about Simon's cartographies and organizing my thoughts in some cohesive way has felt a bit uncomfortable, given the formal research protocols and proposals to which I am accustomed. I also recognize that there is some ethical complexity in doing research with one's own child in terms of assent, anonymity, and risk. Those ideas that we are taught are quite important as researchers and methodologists, and that come to stand as representations of sound research practices. So it is here where I again invoke the work of posthumanist scholars who understand research ethics as immanent, relational, and concerned with, as Baudin writes, enabling new realities. Lenz Deguchi, Osgood, Traffy Pratts, and many others recognize this type of ethics as inextricable from care. An ethics of care, as Baudin suggests, is about enabling a multiplicity of realities to emerge in close collaboration with participating children. Pragmatically, an ethics of care means that I am thinking with Simon, his maps and stories, as I, quote, work the hyphen of researcher-parent. Hackett reminds us that in research, the relationship between identity and the field are not fixed. Researchers who take up and engage in an ethics of care seek to resist hierarchical separation between respondent and participant. It is in working the hyphen that I recognize myself in Simon's maps and stories too. I was and am a part of his contexts, as his mother, as documenter, as fellow wanderer and wonderer, as listener. Rinaldi elaborates on this notion of listening to and with children when she writes that listening means being open to others and what they have to say, listening to the 100 and more languages with all our senses, Listening legitimizes the other person because communication is one of the fundamental means of giving form to thought. Thompson elaborates on how listening to children acknowledges their capacity to reflect upon and represent their own lives and learning. The focus when listening is an act of care, then, is not jumping to interpretation, but as Stewart describes, slowing the quick jump, to be with, to linger with the child in the moments that objects become things and things become worlds. So another pragmatic point of an ethics of care that I'm still working through, but want to mention here, involves creating space for participants to deterritorialize any conclusions that we might come to. While I was a co-participant in Simon's map making, he has become a co-creator of this talk and corresponding PowerPoint presentation, offering suggestions and revisions to stories that he first told 2 years ago, somehow making things a bit less tidy and a bit more reflective of the process of becoming that produces this project. In research with children that holds on to care and eminence, we honor the notion that children have a way of engaging with potential and that we might do well to step aside so that children can show us what else there might be. So here I move to 3 scenes and the respective things specific to Simon's cartographies during the coronavirus pandemic. In thinking through his map making and worlding, I suggest that he created worlds that allowed him and us to exist in excess of his life with mom at home during the pandemic. And inseparable from the worldings that emerged with Simon and his maps are the relationships and contexts in which the maps were created. So this is scene 1, mapping geological hazards and anxieties. On the morning of March 18th, 2020, 5 days after Simon's daycare and my university closed, our house shook. Simon was asleep with me, and I vividly remember asking him to stop moving the bed as it seemed to bounce around on the floor. It occurred to me only after our neighbors called to check on us that it was ridiculous of me to accuse a 28-pound 2-year-old who was sleeping soundly of shaking the bed with enough force to wake a grown woman. I had been awakened instead by a 5.7 magnitude earthquake with an epicenter about 90 miles or 144 kilometers from our house. For the next few days, wall-to-wall news coverage of the pandemic was interrupted only by footage of the aftermath of the earthquake that rattled Salt Lake City and its surrounding communities. Simon and I talked a bit about earthquakes as we built block towers and raced cars across the floor, while the newscasters on television showed video of brick facades that had crumbled onto sidewalks in the city and damaged empty school buildings. Simon did not seem overly concerned about another earthquake, though I was certainly anxious about aftershocks, having heard that folks in our area were always awaiting the big one, as we were positioned directly on the Wasatch Fault line. Though I do not recall telling Simon about my worry, I'm sure that he noticed how much time I was spending looking up geological hazards in our area and checking the United States Geological Survey's earthquake status reports on the computer. And of course, there was the news coverage. So it was in this context that Simon's map of another geological hazard emerged. I'll make sure the volume's up. Wait, Simon, tell me what that is one more time.
That's a volcano, like Oma Opa.
Oh my goodness. So it's your Oma and a volcano?
Huh.
Whoa, what else are you drawing?
It's all the way out.
All the way out? That is amazing. Cool volcano, bud. Who else did you draw? That's Oma, and who else is at the volcano? Anybody else?
My kid.
Your kids? Simon made this volcano map the day after our house shook. The intensity of our immediate context with a pandemic, an earthquake, a lockdown, and disruptions to our routine spilled into his making. A reminder that, this is a quote from Tina Thompson, children exist in specific sociocultural contexts and communities, in circumstances that supply many of the material and interpretive research at children's disposal. Oma, Simon's beloved grandmother, is inside the volcano. His kids are close by. The volcano is erupting all the way out. not just rumbling, but a full-blown eruption that would surely devastate anyone and anything in its path. One might deduce from the intense movements of the marker across the paper, the pounding on the table to indicate the location of the magma bubbling up to exit as lava, the sound effects, the embodied eruption, the hunched over body with the tongue sticking out, and my rapid-fire questions that a profound worlding was coming together. In these moments surrounding the volcano worlding, art supplies that had been left out on a small table came together with Simon's increasing muscle and motor development, his exposure to the news and his mother's anxieties, his memories of how volcanoes work from the books that we had read about natural disasters, all provocations coming into relation with each other to create a map that allowed him to dictate the peril, and if he chose, a resolution. To fully appreciate worlding, we must engage with what Manning and Osgood, Anderson, and Oderstad described as the speculative middle, which opens up the possibility of what the child mother earthquake volcano map may have been producing, rather than seeking meanings or explanations. As you can see, I tried to do with my questions and comments in the video. Perhaps this worlding was an opportunity for Simon to experience intensity in his body and to come into relationship with things to show that intensity on the page. Stewart wrote that visceral attachments incite and animate identifications, responsibilities, and connections. Through his volcano worlding, perhaps Simon and things created the opportunity for him to understand and experience everything that we were in the midst of on his own terms. This is going to start to play again, but I'll try to click quickly. Okay. Scene 2, mapping away to Oma and Opa's house. In May of 2021, Simon drew another map. It had been over a year since we had traveled, and about that long since we had seen Simon's grandparents, Oma and Opa. I was beginning the process of making lists of what we would need and planning our hotel stays during what would be a 29-hour drive from Utah to Florida, where Oma and Opa lived. The weather was starting to feel a bit more like spring than winter. Winters in Utah are long and cold. For about 6 months out of the year, the white on the ground matches the cloud cover above, and on some days, the haziness from the poor air quality makes it difficult to distinguish where earth ends and sky begins. But when the days turn warmer and the sky a bit more blue, like on the day that Simon created his map, everything feels a bit less monochromatic and, dare I say, a bit more hopeful. At Simon's request, I put our shoebox full of sidewalk chalk in the driveway. As I tinkered with plans to get our bikes on the car for our trip, Simon created our map.
At this, and then we will go for the So this it's also
Okay.
so this was and then on the wall over here was the wall of bricks. And that little circle that help get to my Opa's house.
All right. The wobbly bridge and the circles. Now come down here. Can you tell me what this stuff is again? I've already forgotten.
Okay. Lowest
Okay.
road,
Mm-hmm.
bumpy road.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Go back here. Can you tell me? So I know part of it's the forest. What's the rest?
So, road,
Well, this part right here. Can you tell me what all this is? The different colors?
so this is honking, this is bouncing, this is
Oh, gotcha.
get to my
All right. Simon was insistent that the roads on the map be connected. He extended lines so that they touched other lines because even the tiniest gap would hinder us from getting to our destination, a place that he had asked about visiting since the start of the pandemic, a longing finally being realized. In connecting the components with lines, the process of getting from point A, the forest, to point B, Oma and Opa's house, seems quite linear. But for me anyway, it is the business in the middle that makes things a bit more unpredictable. A bumpy road, a wobbly bridge through the circles. Simon's play with terrain and travel in his Utah to Florida worlding enacted imagine spaces and possible worlds, to borrow from Edmonston. Imagine spaces that were arguably a lot more exciting than what we might actually experience on our trip. I had already started complaining about the boring drive across Nebraska. And so in connecting lines to complete the map and creating terrain that might be tricky to navigate, Simon and sidewalk chalk blurred the straightforwardness of our upcoming trip. His Utah to Florida map opened up possibilities for an adrenaline rush, danger, and ultimately success once we arrived at our destination. But perhaps what strikes me the most as I watch and rewatch this video of Simon's mapping involves my own stubborn persistence in wanting to understand what was close to the forest. It is clear that he knows that I want him to say something specific, but he doesn't know what that is, and I don't know either. And so Simon, like children do in school all of the time when adults ask them to explain things that do not necessarily matter to them or are not the most exciting parts of their stories, fills the space. Honkin, and this is Spongsten, and this is Marrow, he mumbles. In perseverating on answers that I was sure were there, Manning calls this, quote, being too concerned with the presumed overlay of content and form. I seemed to disrupt the effective flow that was propelling Simon's story. Or at least in that moment, I kind of missed the point. But it was not enough to stop his storying altogether, and he got right back to what mattered to him, mapping the journey. On the road, wobbly bridge, circles, and that's how you get to Oma and Opa's house. I mentioned earlier that an ethics of care and research with children might involve creating space for children to deterritorialize our understandings of their relationships and interactions. This map invokes such potential. In recent weeks, Simon has joined me while I've pulled together this talk and presentation. He enjoys watching videos of his younger self. And there are parts of this trip to Florida that he remembers vividly. Just the other day, he asked to watch the video of his drawing the Utah to Florida wobbly bridge map. As we watched it together, I commented to him that I wasn't sure what was happening when I kept asking him to tell me about the things near the forest. After thinking for a moment, Simon suggested, well, maybe that was the desert. Manning reminds us that what matters is not what drawings children make, but how the drawings reveal potential worlds. In suggesting a desert, perhaps Simon was opening up yet another possibility in our journey, another potential world to explore on the way. Or perhaps he was offering something to satiate his mother, who, even with her post-human ontoepistemologies, at times seeks clarity and a conclusion. Or perhaps, with his suggestion, Simon was offering a gentle reminder that there are always more possibilities that elude our capture. Scene 3, when maps become otherwise. About a month after we left for Florida, we started the drive back to Utah. Another 29 hours of circles, wobbly bridges, and roads through forests, and now possibly deserts. In Kentucky, we found a rest area with free road maps for travelers passing through. Simon was delighted. I glanced in the rearview mirror at the sound of the map being unfolded. For about 3 minutes, the sounds of the young navigator came from the back seat. Be like this. I could tell that he was rotating the map, getting himself oriented, or getting the map oriented to himself. For a few moments, there was silence as Simon studied the red, black, and blue lines on the paper, shades of gray and green, yellow highlights, larger areas of blue. Mom, he finally called to me. If we follow this road, we'll drive right off this cliff. I laughed at the vision of us careening and going airborne off a cliff in rural Kentucky. I grabbed my phone and, perhaps not very safely, took this picture of Simon. His head and face were obscured by the largeness of the road map, which could have easily wrapped itself around his small body. "Mom," Simon said once I had regained my composure, "if we do drive off a cliff, I will jump to the bottom and my friends and I will hold the corners of the map and we will spread it out and catch you." Through Simon's deterritorialization, the map in his hands was imbued with potential to become something otherwise, a safety net that emerged in the relationship between an imaginative child who seeks ways to create danger and rescue, the materiality of the map itself, unfamiliar roads, and particular narratives that Simon engaged with regularly. This is Chase. He is a German Shepherd police puppy and member of the Paw Patrol. He lives in Adventure Bay with his human rider and a team of rescue pups. And inside that yellow launcher, raised slightly above his shoulder, there is a net that is often deployed to catch falling objects before they hit the ground. Chase has been a mainstay in our home since the beginning of the pandemic, saving Lego figurines and stuffed animals alike from the everyday hazards that befall them, sometimes using his grappling hook, sometimes his car, and very frequently with his safety net. Holding the road map of Kentucky, with its largeness and ability to be spread out to cover a lot of space, while also having the quality of being folded up and tucked away for a future rescue, Simon created his own safety net that he could expand to rescue me. Stewart writes that the details of a thing matter not because of their truth value or what they symbolize, but because they are movements of a field forming up. They matter not because of a logic or a hierarchy of what matters, but first because they have come to matter. The roadmap came to matter because of the potential that emerged in its relationship with Simon, our drive across the country, and imaginings of danger. As the rescue assemblage developed, it brought together Simon's knowledge of safety net deployment, the physics of driving off a cliff, and the glory of a rescue, a deterritorialization of a map to create an excess that could have never been predicted or anticipated outside of the worlding coming together. So across these three scenes, I have considered how things come together as worldings in the relationships between objects, Simon, and me during a pandemic. Entangled in the relationships between materials and contexts, Simon's cartographies afforded him the opportunity to create stories that perhaps deepened his own understanding and okayness during a very uncertain time. Being in control of unfolding stories about his Oma in an erupting volcano, a dangerous drive to Florida, and his mother careening off a cliff in Kentucky provided the opportunity for him to control the narrative and to demonstrate his own perceived courage during a frightening time when everything else felt very much out of our control. His cartographies highlight his always becoming in relation to, as he stories his world in a way that connects to the matter that matters to him. One of the reasons that I'm so drawn to Stewart's descriptions of worlding as a theory is her corresponding explication of attunement. Drawing on McCormack, Stewart writes that attunement is a form of ethics. Tactile compositions animate both objects and the attachments and attunements that constitute selves. They are felt as ways of going on in the world, as increases and decreases, brightenings and darkenings. In looking closely, listening carefully, and being with Simon, I more clearly recognize my own entanglement in his play and making, allowing myself to feel the sensations of the unexpected and allowing myself to be swept up in a playful experimentation with the excess of what else there might be. For me, becoming entangled with Simon's maps and stories offers the opportunity to reflect on the contradictions of thinking with post-humanist philosophies and truly living them, as I in one breath claim to honor open-endedness and indeterminate play with things, and in the next seek answers so that I can come to a clearer understanding and draw conclusions. Simon's cartographies are teaching me the importance of staying with the contradictions in order that I might become more deliberate, more intentional, and more attuned to those around me and what matters to them in the stories they tell and the worlds they make. The indeterminacy and experimentation of childhood was sensed more acutely as I worked in the hyphen of researcher mother, lingering in the in-between space of uncertainty about what elaborations to seek, what responses to articulate, and the extent to which I insert myself into his play. As a researcher mother, I became attuned to his relationships, to him as a creator and artist, an explainer, a helper and rescuer. Through being with Simon in this worlding and storing, I have come to a new appreciation for the indeterminacy of childhood, and now holding spaces for children to make, tell, and then revise and revise their stories again might open up new ways of thinking for those who live with and love them. Thank you.
So at this time we are, sorry, I was reading a note there. So at this time we are willing to take some questions. We have a little bit of time that we've reserved for that. So you're welcome to send your questions to the Q&A. And in the event that you would like to ask your question directly to Kortney, you are certainly welcome to do so. We can unmute you. Just let us know if that's your preference.
Can you hear me, Kortney?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed that presentation. And one of the things I found myself thinking about, or wondering about, is when you reflect on your experiences with Simon and his map making, worlding, what you understand the implications for classroom teachers to be, right? Because
Sean.
I was thinking specifically about how often when I assign students multimodal projects or creative projects like you, I'll see things that grab my curiosity and I start to assign intent that oftentimes I find out isn't there, right? And they'll be like, oh, I wasn't even thinking about that. But yeah, that is super creative, right? So I was wondering, like, if you can talk about the implications of that for teachers.
I feel like I should go buy a lottery ticket because I knew someone was going to ask that question. No, I mean, that's it, right? Like, so what about any of this work? What does it mean for classroom practice? And I don't know what the right answer to that question is, but what I think and what I learned in my work with teacher candidates was that there's a need, I think, for teachers to understand that this potential exists and to find ways in the curriculum, either that's handed to them or that they are, ideally building with the children in their classroom. There's a need for the curriculum to have some level of permeability, to use Ann Dyson's ideas, where kids can explore and children can do the unexpected, without, and I think that where I get hung up is that when that unexpected happens, how equipped do teachers need to be to do something with that? And I'm not sure that that's the right question that I ask. I think because so much of this is highly contextual, it's in the moment, that when we try to get teachers to extend that further, maybe some of the magic is lost. And so I guess my response to that question just involves equipping teachers with the language and perhaps with the experiences themselves to understand that this experimentation is going to happen, that it's really rich, and that there are ways to foster it in the classroom, even if it doesn't become like this territorialized thing that becomes a fixture.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And that idea of, and I think it's so hard in the educational landscape today because it's so concerned with, like, where are we going? What is the direction and how are we going to get there? And there's not that room that you describe and to be comfortable with messiness.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm seeing this now, so in the midst of writing this, Simon was starting kindergarten. And for the first time in 12 years, I'm not in teacher education. And so, yeah, obviously I still have that lens and I still carry a lot of those philosophies around, but I see what's coming home in his backpack. Today he brought home a picture of a bow and arrow because B is for bow and arrow. And as I looked at it, I thought, I wonder how his teacher responded to this. If she responded, should she have responded? Like all of that kind of comes at me. So it's something that I think about a lot too. But I also think that so much of this work with and around understanding potentiality, or the, you know, that it exists anyway. I think so much of it is a personal philosophy, and I'm not sure how to instill that in new teachers in particular who didn't have that experience in school necessarily from their own teachers.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation.
Well, thank you.
Just got a question. So we're gonna reroute to a question that comes from Tina. And are you able to read it?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, at the bottom, I'll go ahead and I'll save the longer chat there, but there's a question. Do you see any connection? Well, I'll let you read it first. It's a longer paragraph, so.
The movement toward responsive parenting. Untigering, is that a thing? Is that what that word is? I don't know that word. Is this something I need to read about, Tina? Yeah, I mean, gosh, I can speak a bit to the part of the question. Do you see any connection between what's going on here and the movement toward responsive parenting? I don't know the literature around that, but I'm going to make some inferences here. And yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know if I'm probably not going to answer your question, Tina, but I'm going to talk through this anyway. And that is that in this documentation, which was sort of not my primary role, but sort of how I entered this relationship, you know, so he was not creating the volcano map for me. And actually, if you noticed, I sort of entered the Utah to Florida map after it was already started. So I was not the intended audience for any of this, right? And in that way, I sort of inserted myself into his play. But I think that in terms of attunement, that listening closely piece, that being with peace, I think it gets really, really complicated when, or maybe even undone, when the results of that responsiveness and that withness becomes packaged and shared really, really broadly. So I think what I appreciate so much about this work is that in the moment, it felt very intimate. And that's why sharing it here in this space that I know is a very safe space has been really uncomfortable, because, you know, this is him. And Chris and Hayon and I talked a little bit at the beginning about blurring children's faces. And I mean, I went through all of that, you know, like as his mother, how do, you know, for lack of a better term, how do I protect him while sharing all this stuff? And, you know, I think that, I don't know, I think it certainly begs a whole lot of scrutiny, but for me, recognizing that that so much of parenting is and can be this really intimate attunement, and somehow preserving that and not necessarily distributing it to the masses. There seems to be something there, but I'm not 100% sure what that is. And since I haven't read about untigering, I can't speak to that specifically, but you know, I don't think I'm going to be writing any parenting books anytime soon. But yeah, those ideas of intimacy and attunement, I think, definitely carry over from this work and into my work, perhaps without the hyphen of researcher attached to mother.
So there's another question. I'll go ahead and read it out loud so that everyone is able to kind of follow the question. Working in childcare for over 25 years, coming out of a pandemic, how do we as early learning educators rethink how we look at children? Your reference to Dolores Malaguzzi is a piece that we do need to look at a child with. There are many languages that a child uses to communicate. At the end, he says it is best when Dolores writes, and thus they tell the child that the 100 is not there. The child says, no way, the 100 is there.
Mm. I love this question, and I'm going to bring a literacy lens to this. Because actually Erin Manning sort of does the same in the 2020 piece. So she talks about with these, this idea of the 100 languages, that there are, you know, lots of ways to make and write and draw and to express oneself. And all of that is wrapped up in this literacy paradigm of multimodal literacies, right? So multiple forms of sharing meaning, essentially. Coming out of the pandemic, so I'm going to hold that for just a minute, multimodal literacies, don't let me forget it. Coming out of the pandemic, there's such a strong discourse that might make you want to throw your computer out the window, as it does me, about learning loss and this idea that kids don't have what they need, which again is like determined by these external forces, right? It's not looking at the multitude of competencies and the various forms that those competencies take when children come to school. And that learning loss discourse is so powerful right now. You know, in terms of what counts as, speaking from my personal experience, what counts as literacy in the classroom. And so, so that's one piece of this, right? Is that coming out of a pandemic, while children have always been subjected to developmental and behavioralist paradigms that have boxed them in and ignored their multiple ways of knowing, I suspect now that maybe it's even more striking because we've assumed that that this learning loss has taken place. Going back to that multimodal literacies piece, I knew if I said it out loud, I'd remember to come back to it. You know, I think at some point, the research around multimodal literacies, it's still, of course, critical and in terms of being important. And there's some really interesting stuff coming out about it. But what I'm recognizing is that increasingly, it feels like multimodal literacies are becoming a means to the same end that's been predetermined by those external forces. It's just like, okay, so let's let kids draw this thing so that ultimately they can get to this written alphabetic print-based text thing.
Mhm.
And so, you know, in drawing it, we can say, oh, yay, 100 languages, right? But then what ultimately counts is still just kind of that boxed in definition. And so I knew that I flipped to this page in Manning's piece for a reason. And I don't know what to do about any of this, except I underline this because I think she's onto something. Erin Manning wrote down, and I just for the sake of time, I won't get into all the context again, but she writes, to tear the shit down and build it anew is to engage in the politics of pedagogy, right? And so it seems that there's something on a much, much broader level. I think that teachers can do the work on a micro level in their classrooms, but in order for folks to recognize that the discourse of learning loss is doing a lot of damage, that to hold up multimodal literacies in the light of 100 languages, if it's all gonna, you know, wind up looking the same in the end anyway, because that's what we expect of children, like that's not gonna cut it. So tear the shit down, I guess. but and I'm not in the academy anymore, so you know I'll leave that up to you guys.
We may have reached the end here. So again, Kortney, as always, it was a pleasure to be able to have some time to think and learn with you, and we very much appreciate the care that you put into this presentation for us today. And for those in attendance, we also appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. And stay tuned for an additional follow-up dialogue with Kortney, which will appear, well, as soon as we can find a time to make that work, but it shouldn't be too long. And then for those who were unable to make it today, if you had colleagues or friends who couldn't be here, make sure to let them know that a recording of this presentation will be made available on our website and YouTube channel probably within the next few days. So again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Kortney.
Yeah, thank you all. It's great to be with so many of you. Thank you.